What's going on, everybody? It is me, Ben Cornett, and welcome to another episode of Have At It, episode 111. And today we are going to be focusing solely on one topic. As you can see on the bottom of the screen there, that topic is Todd Bowles. He will be back in 2026 to coach your Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And my thoughts on that. But first off, want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Again, this is Have At It episode 111. You can watch this on my YouTube channel, Ben Cornett 9015, as well as on Facebook in the Ben Zone. Man, so we just heard the news today that Todd Bowles will be retained by the Buccaneers. He had meetings with ownership Tuesday, and it is official as far as we know. So it's very interesting. Todd Bowles did not have a great stretch the last couple months of the year. First off, the Bucks went 6-2 in the first half, then plummeted to 2-7. And although they won their last game against Carolina, they did end up not making the playoffs because of the tiebreakers that Atlanta beat New Orleans, which made both the Bucks, Falcons, and Panthers 8-9 and have the same division record, 3-3. But Carolina won the division based on record versus common opponents. So there you go. And that also ended the Bucks streak at winning division titles at 4. So that's that. And there's a lot of questions that should Bowles have been fired for that? Should he have stayed on? My thought was, having a collapse like that should, probably call for termination. I mean, especially after he had a 6-2 start, especially when, as soon as everybody got healthy, he actually did worse. And the meltdown, I thought what doomed the season was the Thursday night game against Atlanta. And being up 28-14 going into the fourth quarter, and then ultimately giving the game away on prime time Thursday night. People may say, well, what about the game against the Saints? I mean, you could argue that as well. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to share this share my show, by the way. Just bear with me. Yeah, so the Saints loss was bad, at home. But the Falcons won, and it was on national TV, albeit Prime Video, but nonetheless, I mean, it was a bad loss, and I think that just doomed them from there, because then they went to Carolina, lost that game. They went to Miami, where they lost to a guy that is really going to just be a backup in the NFL, and Quinn Ewers and the Miami Dolphins. Nothing to play for. And the Bucks blew that game. And then they had to play a winner take all. Well, at least for Carolina it was, but for the Bucks, it was a win and then hope Atlanta, would lose. The Saints would help them out, which ultimately they didn't. So, yeah, and then that was it. Now getting back to Todd Bowles, does that warrant him being gone? The defense was not good all year. Let's be honest. Now, the offense did carry the defense for a few games there, won close games, but ultimately the offense couldn't do it every game, you know. And it's not all on Todd Bowles. Some of it is because, again, at the end of the day, he's the head coach. He's in charge of all the coordinators. He has to make sure all the coordinators are doing their job. When you're a head coach, you're like the CEO. You're running everybody. You're overseeing people that are on your staff, making sure they do their jobs. And with Todd, it's really unique because he's also defensive coordinator, so he's wearing multiple hats. And sometimes that can work. Sean McVay does it. I know he has an OC too, but really though, it might be just by name. I know Doug McDermott does it with Buffalo. It can work for some people, but it doesn't work for everybody. And I can tell it doesn't work for Todd Bowles. And I'm sure one of the conditions that were made when they had those talks, I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying I would bet that one of the conditions is he would have to find a defensive coordinator to stay on. He's going to have to change staff. Like I said, I'm not a fan of it, but it's what's done is done. He's back. Let's see what he can do. He's got to get the right coordinators, but that could be an issue too, because he's going into 2026 pretty much on the hot seat. And for coordinators out there, for people on other staffs, on other teams, they may look at that and say, well, I don't know if I'm going to be guaranteed to be there. If I take this position, the OC or the DC, is there a guarantee that I'll be back after 2026? What if somebody like a Cliff Kingsbury, who just got released by the Commanders, and he's going to get some head coaching interviews as well. But what if, the Bucs decide, okay, hey, give Cliff a call, which I think would be good. I like Kingsbury as an offensive coordinator. But what if he's like, looking at this situation saying, well, is Todd Bowles going to be here beyond 2026? We don't know. Then I could be out of a job again. So it's going to be difficult to get some good offensive coordinators coming in and defensive coordinators, assuming that Josh Grizzard's not retained, which, again, from what it sounds like, there's going to be changes in the staff. So, we'll see how it goes. I mean, I've heard names like, Kingsbury, Stefanski, but like Stefanski, I'm sure wants to be a head coach. He'll probably get a job. Maybe the Titans, maybe the Raiders. So then they got a Nate. I don't want to butcher the name. Nate Scalahassie, I think his name is, and with the Rams, like he's like video coordinator. He's highly thought of with Sean McVay. Say he's very brilliant, so that would be a very good OC. But then again, there's a lot of other teams that are looking for offensive coordinators. The Commanders, the Giants. They're not just looking for head coaches. But the head coaches are going to pick their staff, so they might. Let's assume like John Harbaugh gets the Giants job. He's going to take Todd Monken with him. So Monken might be he might be off the list. He might just join with Harbaugh. So, because you're not going to worry about John Harbaugh being on the hot seat. But you're going to worry about Todd Bowles because, yes, he's being retained, but how safe is his job though? And that's where I think a lot of coordinators are going to, you know, be a little worried, like they're not too sure if they want to take this job. Yes, you got Baker Mayfield, but the thing is, Baker Mayfield's only here for one more season, before his contract's up. So it's going to be interesting to see what Todd Bowles does. It really is because who he gets and who comes to Tampa. I mean, this is a big deal, um, because I think even Bowles knows that his seat is hot, and he has to get this right. He does. So does Jason Licht. Let's not forget. Light. He can't go without blame. Some questionable draft picks. I know he's tried to get defensive ends, but they haven't panned out. So it's not just Todd Bowles. I want people to remember it's not just on Todd Bowles. It's all his fault. Players didn't play well this year. Then you have Jason Licht, who's had some good drafts, but he's had some bad ones too. And on the offensive side of the ball, Baker Mayfield, he had some turnovers, didn't play his best. I know he was injured, but everybody's injured this time of year. So and that's another thing, that the ownership looked at it as maybe we had so many injuries and that kind of affected this team. Who knows? Let's see where to comment here. Marty, thanks Marty for tuning in. How you doing, man? I wouldn't mind if we put that up there. I wouldn't mind if we signed a well-known offensive coordinator with the promise of maybe being a head coach. I mean, I would like that as well, but again, Marty, as I mentioned earlier, it depends if some of these coordinators want the job. That's the thing, and do they trust ownership that that they'll do that? Sure, they'll say that, but what if the Bucks do good this year and get to the playoffs next year in 2026? That almost guarantees Bowles will be back again. So, which again, that's a good thing if we make the playoffs. Get back to what we were doing before. But how do we know that coordinator's like, well, how much longer am I going to wait? They might be like Blean Cohen, like Dave Canales. They might be like, well, they're going to be calling me. I might as well take the, go elsewhere. So, it's a tricky situation to say the least. It's risky. So, we'll see how it plays out. But they got to get it right. Jason Licht needs to be out there making phone calls with when free agency opens, try to recruit like his job depends on it. Yeah. This is big too, because Marty, everybody else watching, that everybody's jobs seem to be on the line. But I want to kind of say this one real quick, that I think another thing that factored into Bowles keeping his job that a lot of people aren't really mentioning, and that's Bruce Arians, who's the advisor to Jason Licht in the front office. Bruce did bring Todd in. He put in Todd Bowles as his predecessor when Bruce retired. And I think that held weight, because Bruce is a very, charming guy. He can convince you of a lot of things. And, when, I know people were saying, well, Pat McAfee was on the show, people were saying, oh, it's just lip service. That's, but it felt different though, because, when Bruce says things, you kind of can tell when it's true and when it's not. But Bruce had a different kind of confidence to him when he was talking. He wasn't too, overboard or, too defensive. He was pretty calm, like he knew that they were going to keep Todd. So, that's when I felt like, I think it's happening. I think they're going to keep him. You know, um, but and then you got other factors too, guys. That, ladies and gentlemen, that maybe the Glazers looked at the situation like there may not be any good candidates out there. Now, it was reported that they informed Todd of the decision after John Harbaugh was let go, which he's going to be the hottest commodity out there. You know, so it could be one of those things where the Glazers didn't feel comfortable, and also, they just gave Todd an extension. So probably don't want to pay for two coaches. Now, people are going to say, well, they did that with Gruden, and they fired him after what, after a year. But I will say that those were very different circumstances, because John Gruden, at the time, Malcolm Glazer was still around. Now didn't have much involvement, but he was still around. And also the fact that people will say, well, Tony Dungy, they fired him, got John Gruden in a trade, but that was all done by Malcolm. They made that move. Malcolm made that move, I should say. And the Glazers, I think also you got to realize maybe they felt like, if we fire Todd now, like they did with Gruden, they felt what happened was you had what they called the decade of the depression. When the Bucks went 10 some odd years without a playoff appearance. And they went through various head coaches. So maybe the fear of, not wanting to go through that again, maybe crossed their mind. Like, look, he's won, 3 division titles for us. We still got the talent. We got the pieces. We just need to, get a few, make a few little changes, and then that should be good. Now, my opinion is I don't see Todd Bowles as that guy that's going to lead us to a Super Bowl. I just don't. He's just not that kind of coach. You look at the situation with the Jets, and granted, the Jets was bad. It's a bad organization. It still is. But he didn't exactly light the world on fire there either. I mean, he did go 10-6 his first year there. Then he had 3 straight years of 5-11 seasons. But you also notice the pattern with the Bucks, where the first year he was 8-9. Then he went 10-7 his best year in 2023. Then he went 9-8 in 2024. 8-9 this year, 2025. So he's been pretty much middle of the pack in a bad division. And to me, it's like, how's that going to change with different coordinators? Because once again, you're going to have probably a different offensive coordinator. You've had the same players pretty much, the same quarterback, since 2023. You've had the same receivers, Evans, Godwin, Rashad White, Cade Otton. You've had the same defense, Vita Vea, Antoine Winfield, Jamel Dean. You've had the same pieces, and yet somehow you can't take that next step. That's what I mean when I say I don't believe in Todd Bowles, that he's going to right the ship and lead the Bucks to be a Super Bowl contender, because even when he's made the playoff, he's only won 1 game. He's 1-3. So that's what it's a risk bringing him back for sure. They have to get it right now. If they don't, then Bulls will be let go. He will be pretty much gone. But then what do you do after that? What if next year there's not as many good candidates out there? You know, so it's a risk either way, and all we can do is see what happens and go from there. See if he can get the right piece, and so does Jason Light. He has to get hit the draft picks. Now again, Buka had a great year, great rookie year. At least for the first few months. Then the last few games he fizzled. Now a lot of that had to do with everybody starting to get healthy again. So, but he's got to hit some home runs here. Again, we won't know because it can't get it done overnight. But they got to get it right, and in free agency as well. There's talk about possibly going out and get an edge rusher. I'm hearing things about with Max Crosby with the Raiders. But the thing is, Max is going to probably cost you a lot of draft capital. And that's another criticism of Jason Light is, he values those draft picks. He's not going to trade them for anything. But, you're at a point now where, your job's on the line. You're attached to Todd Bowles. So you're going to have to make some moves. If the Raiders are willing to part with Max Crosby, I mean, why not do it? Because if you feel like this team can get back on track and be a playoff team and go further in the playoffs, Max Crosby is that edge rusher you need. Believe me, I know. I live here in Vegas. I've seen the guy play. Trey Hendrickson is out there, free agency. Like I said in past shows, I'm a little hesitant of that one because of the injury history. Do I trust Trey? Getting a little older. Max is a couple years younger, still has a lot of upside. But the Bucs have to do something, defensively because they could not get to the quarterback this year. And again, part of it's, the players, but also that's part of it's on Todd Bowles' him and his staff. And I really hope that Todd Bowles does give up defensive play calling duties. Right now it's lip service. Yeah, sure. He's expected to make moves, but will he? How many moves will he make? Will he make that many moves? Because I've seen in the past with other teams where they've forced coaches, hey, we'll keep you, but you got to make some moves. And then they make minimal moves at best. So how much does it really mean? But for the Bucs, it's vital, because as crappy as this division's been, it's not going to stay like crap forever. Carolina made the playoffs this year. They're improving. Atlanta, I keep saying how overrated they are, and they are. But they may get a coach that comes in there and finally figures it out. New Orleans, look how good they played down the stretch. Tyler Shough played well, and Kellen Moore did a good job of giving that team a chance down the stretch to be a viable contender in the NFC South in 2026. Despite their cap issues and stuff. Kellen Moore did a good job of helping Tyler Shough get along, develop him. We'll see what happens in year 2, but they've had some decent drafts lately. So, the Bucs can't just sit on their laurels and, say, 9-8 is going to be good enough to win the division, because it's not. Teams are going to get better in that division eventually. So next year's it's a must win for Todd Bowles. I think anything short of the postseason, he's gone. I think the Glazers won't mess around then. So some comments in here. Marty said it was almost like their mindset is give it one more shot. If it doesn't work, then we're going to go into rebuild mode. Well, that's another thing I want to address. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe if they don't get one more squeeze of the lemon out of this, do they go in rebuild mode? That's another risk because now, you got a fan base that's infuriated that they kept Bowles. And I personally am not infuriated. I'm not happy about it, but I'm not infuriated because it's not my call. They're not, the Glazers aren't going to make the decision based on my opinion, or anybody else's. Now, if this doesn't work out and the Bucks have another season where, let's say, they're 7-10, don't make the playoffs, then they got to let go. And then Baker Mayfield struggles, doesn't earn that big payday. If Chris Godwin can't stay healthy, we don't draft well, if we don't hit it in free agency, yeah, you may have no choice but to rebuild. And that's going to even infuriate the fan base even more because now you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be looking up at the division for a while unless you hit on draft picks. Maybe they get a new GM, just a whole new front office. These are, turbulent times for the Bucks. And let's face it, I mean, since 2020, we've been eating like kings. We had a Super Bowl, we've been to the playoffs, except for this year. You can't have these runs forever. You're going to have ebb and flows, and this may be the time where the Bucks start going downward and then rebuild to go upward. Now I know the Bucks are doing everything they can to not rebuild, but to retool. But you have an older roster. Levante David's not guaranteed to come back. He may retire. Mike Evans may not be re-signing with the Bucks. He's a free agent. I think he will, but I'm just saying there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees Chris Godwin's going to stay healthy. We know how that's turned out. So there's a lot of risk in that. That's why I said, I'm not thrilled about Bowles being back. I think getting a new head coach could rejuvenate, some guys like a Baker or a Mike Evans. Just a different voice in the locker room would be great. But the Glazers, Jason Light, decided that we're going to give this thing one more try. It kind of feels like, like a marriage that you kind of know it's going to be they're going to get divorced. It's not going to work out, but they're willing to give it another try. They're willing to go to counseling. They're willing to do this and that, save the marriage. And I just don't know if it'll work, but it depends on who they hire, who they fill in those positions to help, this team out. Will they get a legitimate OC? Will they get maybe a defensive coordinator? Because we don't know if Bowles will give up his defensive play calling. Bowles has been very stubborn about that. So we'll see what happens. When it comes to Max Crosby, I would offer a first-round draft pick this season. Yaya Diaby, Zion McCollum, next year's second-round draft pick. No, you're not going to give up Diaby. The Bucks aren't going to do that. McCollum, maybe. But I think it's going to take 2 first-round draft picks, at least, because if the Jets were able to get 2 first-rounders for Sauce Gardner, the cornerback, 2 for a decent cornerback, what do you think Max Crosby is going to – what do you think the Raiders are going to ask for? They're going to ask for the whole, shebang. And I just don't think Jason Light's going to do it. I get it to an extent because, again, you want to, preserve your draft capital. But when you're in a year where maybe your job's on the line, you're gonna have to do something. So, um, again, I would do what I can to get Max, because if that's the missing piece to getting back to the postseason and going beyond the first weekend of the playoffs, it'd be worth it. Then you got your edge rusher for the next few years, and you could still be a contender. I would do it, but we'll see what Jason Light does. Well, that's pretty much all I got for this. This is going to be a short episode. This is strictly about Todd Bowles, that he's back in 2026. Again, am I happy about it? No. But the Glazers didn't make their decision by what I think or what the fans think. I understand why the fans are frustrated. I don't blame them for that, but nothing we can do now. We just have to hope that the moves that the Bucks make in the offseason, come to fruition and get us back to the postseason. If not, then there'll be no choice but to let Todd Robert Bowles go. Yeah, I said his full name, by the way. So we'll see how it plays out. But anyway, I'm going to take off. I want to thank everybody for watching today. Marty, thanks for, putting it in the comments. Give me a like, share, and subscribe. Ben Cornet 9015 on YouTube. And find me in the Ben Zone on Facebook. And that's all I got, man. So I will see you guys next time. And if there's any other news going on around, I'll try and get back on this week. But again, thanks everybody for watching. And I will see you next time right here on Have At It.